Many people, especially younger adults, now have a low view of marriage or a pessimistic view of marriage because many of them think that if I get married, my chances of having a good marriage are not actually that great. Or even if I do have a lasting marriage, that in some form or fashion, it might be boring. Chris Rock, a comedian, of course, we all know, said this. He asked this question: do you want to be single and lonely or married and bored? And the problem is that most people think that those are the only options, which is why in our culture today, a lot of people aim for something kind of between marriage and just sexual encounters. And so they want the companionship, but they decided to just say, you know what, we're just going to live together. I'm going to live together with my sexual partner. That way I get the benefits of companionship. I get the benefits of sexual fulfillment and things like that, sexual gratification, but I don't have to commit to anything. So if it doesn't work out, then I can just step back. I can just move out. I can just take the relationship and put it to the side. And for those of us who are married, culture has given an easy way out, right? We have what's called in our nation no-fault divorce. And as Tony Evans, pastor, says it, he says, divorce is always someone's fault. There's no such thing as no-fault divorce, but in our country, our government has it, our legislature has it as an option, and really, it was just that they said, you know what, we don't want to do and have to deal with all of this, so what we're going to do is we're going to make it easy. If the two parties in a marriage can come to some kind of agreement, and they can divide up the assets and all that kind of stuff, they come to an agreement, they sign all the documents, they pay the lawyer $90, then we'll just sign off and say, divorce granted. That's a huge problem in our world today because divorce is so easy. But what does the Bible say about marriage? What does the Bible say about commitment? Last week we talked about God's blueprint for marriage. We talked about how God has a specific blueprint. And then today we're going to talk about even really before we build based on that blueprint, because God is the architect of marriage. God is the designer of marriage. We need to have a foundation, and we're going to talk about that foundation today that all of this needs to be built on top of, and we're going to talk about covenant marriage. And when we talk about it today, there's a couple things. Number one, I want to remind people, if you were here last week, you know this, but if you were not here, it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. You might be married, you might not be married, you might be single, you might be divorced, you may be widowed, you may be a teenager, you may be a young person, and you say, you know what, I'm not there yet, but you need to understand this. All of us need to have this same understanding. Because if we don't have this understanding, for all of us, it can cause all of us problems. My kids right now are riding their bikes to school most days. Some days they walk, most days they ride their bikes to school. And guess what? Neither of my two little kids drive, but I need them to understand traffic laws right now. Because if they understand traffic laws, it's going to cause less problems for them and less problems for other people who actually are driving. So just because they're not driving doesn't mean they don't have to know it, because they can cause some major problems, right? If you're driving, of course you need to know traffic laws, but if you're not driving, you still need to know them. It's the same idea with marriage. The problem is a lot of us don't understand it. Even those of us who are in marriage don't understand God's covenant view of marriage. So my prayer today for all of us is that as we look at God's view of covenant marriage, the way He designed it, the way He intended it, this foundation of covenant, that we'll start to see things differently. We'll start to respond differently. We'll start to walk out of here differently. We'll view marriage differently. We'll enter into marriage differently, and we'll live our lives in marriage differently. We'll even talk about it differently. Now, there's a lot of people who fall in love, and there's even a lot of people who get married, but there's not a lot of people who understand the covenant of marriage biblically the way God has designed. Now, we live in a world today where people are always saying, you know what, they're trying to redefine marriage. They're trying to redefine marriage. The government is trying to redefine marriage. The culture is trying to redefine marriage. J.C. Riley in the 1800s, 150 years ago, said this: the marriage relation lies at the very root of the social system of nations. The nearer a nation's laws about marriage approach to the law of Christ, the higher has the moral tone of the nation always proved to be. The closer we are to God's view of marriage as a world, as a culture, as a society, the higher the moral tone of that nation always proved to be. Now, I want to ask a question. You got to think for just a second. How would you define marriage? Last week I said I'm going to say some things that might kind of stress some people out, say some things that maybe might hopefully stretch your mind a little bit, but stress you out. I'm just going to ask you to hang with me for just a second. Even if you go, I don't know what you're saying, just hang with me, okay? Because a lot of us, if we define marriage, we would say marriage is between a man and a woman. I want you to know, biblical covenant marriage is not just between a man and a woman. Do I have your attention? Here's the deal. Biblical covenant marriage is so much bigger than that. When I counsel married couples or couples that are trying to get married, they ask me to do their wedding. I always have a meeting with them and I say, here's the type of weddings I'm willing to do. And if you're willing to go through with that, then I would be happy to perform your marriage. And I tell them from the start, I say, marriage is not between a man and a woman. You keep being told they're trying to redefine marriage. Marriage is just between a man and a woman. Here's the thing. There are a whole lot of people who get married, even a man and a woman, who did not enter into biblical covenant marriage. Now, listen, I'm not saying that gay marriage is biblical by any means. Obviously, not saying anything like that. But marriage, biblical covenant marriage, is a man who is whole and complete in Christ, in relationship with God at the center of their life, and a woman with God at the center of her life, joining together with God at the center of their marriage, is a 3-part union. It is not a 2-part union. And we have a bad understanding of marriage. I actually think that we create a whole lot of problems when we go out as people who are in the church. We go out and say, they're trying to redefine marriage. Here's what I think. I think we shouldn't be trying to hold the government to some kind of standard that the government's not going to hold to because it's a secular institution anyways. I think what we should be doing as Christian people is saying, listen, what the government says about marriage is not even the same thing that I'm doing. I tell people, when you get a marriage license, please don't post a picture and say, it's official, we're getting married, because the government has no say in a biblical covenant marriage. Here's the reality. You can get that license. You can sign that license. A pastor can sign the license. You can turn it in, and the government can put a red stamp that says declined on it and send it back to you. And there's a whole lot of people in our world, Christian people, who would go, well, I guess I'm not really married. You see a problem with that? You see where the problem lies when we have that understanding, when we have a skewed understanding of what marriage is? We think the government has a say in our marriage. It's insane. It's crazy that we think that way. Because I don't need that document. Because guess what? My wife and I have been married for over 18 years. Do you want to know how many times I've seen that marriage license in 18 years? Probably one time when I was trying to pull out my passport, I was like, oh, there's our marriage license. I remember this day. Like, that's it. Because it's a tax document. That is literally all it is. I don't care who gets tax benefits. I'll just be honest with you. I don't think it helps our society. I think, just like this says, the closer we get as a society to God's word, the better off we are as a nation. So I think our society can go this way. But the problem is, what I think we need to be doing is separating the picture of biblical marriage from what we're talking about. Because if two atheists, a man and a woman, get married, there's a lot of people that go, oh, that's marriage. It's not biblical covenant marriage. But if we separate it and we say, you know what, this is what biblical covenant marriage is, then I think we would have an opportunity where the world would say, you know what, there's a whole lot of people that are married, but there's something different about their marriages. They're not fighting just between a man and a woman. They're not having these fights, but I see their marriage and something's different. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that non-Christian people can never have a successful marriage. I think that they can, but what you'll find in every single one of those marriages is that a lot of the same critical elements of biblical covenant marriage are going to be there. There's going to be commitment. There's going to be love. There's going to be this anyhow long-term kind of commitment that I'm going to love you no matter what, like we're going to talk about in just a few moments. But our problem is that not a lot of people understand biblical covenant marriage. And the problem is not that a lot of people out there don't understand it. A lot of people in the church don't understand it. So if you have your Bible, turn to Malachi chapter 2. We're going to end up in Matthew chapter 19. Malachi chapter 2, if you don't know where that is, it's the last book in the Old Testament. So if you go to the New Testament, just go to the left and you'll find it. Malachi chapter 2. To understand biblical covenant marriage, this isn't at verse 13. This is another thing you do. God says, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. So God's not accepting their offering, and so they come with tears and with groaning and with weeping, and they say, "For what reason, God, do you not accept my offering?" And it says, "Because the Lord has been a witness." This word is a legal word, like he's a witness on a stand against you. The Lord has been a witness between you and your wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by, what word? Covenant. Your companion and your wife by covenant. Before we can talk about the biblical marriage covenant, we need to talk and understand the word covenant. So what is a covenant? The first thing you need to understand is covenant is more than a contract. It's more than a contract. All of us in the room have entered into contract. Probably all of us, even the younger people in the room, have entered into some kind of contract where we agree, we have an agreement between two parties. There's terms that are given. We've agreed to those terms and we've signed off on it in some form or fashion. For a lot of us, what happens the most frequently is one of the ways we enter into a contract without even really understanding that's what we're doing is we click that little button, that little square that says, "I have read and agreed to the terms." Raise your hand if you've ever read and agreed to the terms. Exactly. You don't read those. Nobody reads those. But you say, "I have read and I agree to them." You have terms and you said, "I agree to those terms, whatever they are." And now I'm bound by some kind of contract. I'm bound by some kind of release of some kind. A covenant includes a contract, but it is more than a contract. We know what it's like to be in a contractual relationship, but a covenant is tied to relationship. There's three different types of relationships. The first is really a disconnected type of relationship. It's these contractual type of relationships. A contract is basically that you agree to do something, I agree to do something, we reciprocate it, and we're good. If you breach your side, I can breach mine. That's kind of how it works. And here's the thing about this. I don't have to have a relationship with you to be in a contractual relationship with you. Like I said, you can click that box that says, "I have read and agreed to the terms." You don't have to know who sees that you click that box. You don't have to know who's on the other side of that. You just agree to some kind of terms. I don't even have to like you to be in a contractual relationship with you. I could despise you, but if you're offering me a good or a service of some kind, I can enter into a contract with you, and as long as you do your job and I do mine, then we'll be good. There's contractual relationships. The second one is a little bit different. It's kind of similar, but it's a little bit different. It's consumer relationships. Now, this is a little bit more connected, probably some kind of relationship, mild relationship, but basically the idea is this, that you're tied or connected in a relationship that lasts only as long as the other person will meet your needs. That as long as you're giving me what I want in relationship now, in some kind of relationship, shallow or whatever, that as long as you're meeting my needs, then we can keep this relationship going. But the needs of the individual in this kind of relationship are more important than the actual relationship. So if my needs aren't met, then I can push the relationship aside. I don't have to worry about anything else. I just push it aside. Now, before the Enlightenment, it wasn't just religious people that had a high view of marriage. There were societies, towns, villages, peoples that had a high view of marriage. One of the reasons they had a high view of marriage was because they saw that children tend to grow and thrive and flourish in a stable marriage environment. So it was really important to nations, to towns, to villages, to cities. And the opposite, of course, is true, currently affecting our world and our nation today. But a new view of marriage really started to take major shifts around the 18th and 19th century as a part of the Enlightenment. Because the Enlightenment was really about bringing on new ideas about the meaning of life, really being individualistic and really being about personal fulfillment. And this is where consumer relationships come into play. So just like anything else, because all of my relationships and all of my life, if my purpose is about individual fulfillment, if I'm in a relationship with you and it's not fulfilling me in some form or fashion, then I can just put it aside. It doesn't matter anymore. This is a result of the Enlightenment times. The last one is covenant relationships. This is deeply tied together by relationship, and this is where the relationship is more important than the immediate needs of the individual. It's entirely different, entirely the opposite. And this is why biblical covenant marriage is not without passion. It's not boring, like Chris Rock would say. In fact, it's just the opposite. It still has passion, but it's more than that. Tim Keller says this. He says, covenant marriage is a relationship far more intimate and personal than a merely legal business relationship. Yet at the same time, it is far more durable, binding, and unconditional than one based merely on feeling and affection. A covenant relationship is a stunning blend of law and love. A covenant relationship is a stunning blend of law and love. Now, covenants are everywhere in history and in different cultures. All through history, we get to see different types of these covenant symbols and how they happen at different times. In our culture today, in our world today, people sign a document as a symbol of this is the vow, the covenant I'm making with you, the promise I'm making to you. So we'll sign a document that's really just a contract. There were times where people would break glass, and even in some cultures today, they still break glass. Or maybe jumping the broom was another cultural understanding that this is a symbol of a promise that I'm making. All these different times we see it. But in the Old Testament time, when people would enter into a covenant, when two people would enter into a covenant, what they would do is they'd take a lamb or a goat and they would kill it. Then they would cut it in half and separate the two parts of the carcass apart. And then the two parties would walk down the middle. And here's what they would say when they would walk down the middle between these two halves. They would say, "May God do so to me if I ever break this covenant with you and with God. May God cut me in half if I ever break this covenant with you and with God." You kind of get the feeling that covenant in those days maybe meant something a little bit more when they would make statements like that, when they would take it that seriously. There's three types of covenants that we see in Scripture, that I think we see in Scripture. The first is horizontal covenants. That's a covenant, a person to a person. I'm going to make this horizontal level covenant or commitment. Then there's vertical covenants. That's a covenant made from God with his people, maybe with an individual or a group of people or a family. That's a vertical covenant. And there's what I call a divine covenant. That's made between a man and a woman before God, and God joins that covenant together. This is where biblical covenant marriage comes in. It's that kind of picture. Biblical covenant marriage. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to or cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That Hebrew verb, to cleave to, literally means to be glued together. Now, we talked about different tools that we're going to be building with. Here's your tool, super glue. Okay? This is the picture of what covenant marriage is. It means to be glued together. And it's not like just, Elmer's glue, right? Like it's not the stuff that's just easy to tear apart. No, it's super glue. Somebody came up to me at the end of last service. They said, really, it's supernatural glue, right? Like this is the picture. They said, I was waiting for you to say that. It's super glue. This is the picture of biblical covenant marriage, that I'm glued together, that I'm glued to this person. To unite to somebody through a covenant, a binding promise or an oath, is to be glued to them. And biblical covenant marriage is the deepest type of relationship, the deepest covenant relationship possible, because it includes both very strong horizontal covenants and a very strong vertical covenant. That's why it becomes the strongest and deepest covenant relationship. Proverbs chapter 2, talking about a wayward wife, it says, a wayward wife who has left the partner of her youth and ignored the covenant that she made before God. The covenant that she made before God. When God gets to see it, it's done before God and done before a spouse. When you and I break that covenant, here's what it means. It doesn't mean we're just breaking that covenant with our spouse. It means we're breaking it with God. And there's a major problem when we look at divine covenants, is that God is the only one who can break a divine covenant. God is the only one who could do it. Listen, Jesus was asked this question by the Pharisees. It says, Matthew chapter 19, verse 3, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Did you know that some rabbinical schools, some of the schools for the rabbis in those days taught that if a man is just unsatisfied, even in a moment, he can divorce his wife? And so they're saying, is it true that we could do that? Here's what Jesus says. Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Verse 6, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together. Who joined together? What God has joined together, let no man separate. Let no what separate? Man. Why does he say this? Because man does not have the authority to override a covenant that is made by God and that is joined together by God. So when you enter into covenant marriage, here's what happens. You stand before that person, enter before God and before other people and before that person. You enter into covenant marriage. God up in heaven goes, boom, stamped covenant marriage. And then what happens with a lot of people in our world today is they'll have problems, they'll have difficulties, they'll have struggles, they'll have fights and battles, and they're like, oh, I just can't do this anymore. And they'll go to a man who's a judge. It might be a woman who's a judge, but a human who's a judge. They'll go to mankind and say, hey, we can't do this anymore. And that person will go, stamped, divorced, here you go. And God says, nope, not divorced. Because that man does not have the authority to break a divine covenant. Even if he says divorce granted, God says divorce not granted. Because that man cannot break what God has joined together. Now there is a clarification. We see that Jesus does say in Matthew chapter 5, he actually says, if you put away your wife, if you divorce your wife and marry another, you're committing adultery. And the one exception was for marital unfaithfulness. So I'm not going to count that out. He does say that, but he says that you can divorce your wife all you want, but God holds the position that you're still married, except for that qualification. It's a divine covenant. A lot of times what happens is people will come and they'll come to a pastor or they'll come before their family and friends and before God, and they'll make this commitment and this covenant. And then when things start struggling and fighting, what they're going to do is they're going to go find somebody else who's in a marriage that's struggling and fighting, and they're going to go out, they're going to have drinks, and they're going to start talking bad about marriage, and that person's going to go, oh, you know what, you just need to leave him, or you just need to leave her, you need to let them go. And that's kind of how it starts to roll, right? And then eventually they'll go to a judge instead of going to the people that were actually a part of what was happening, instead of going to the pastor and saying, hey, we need some help. We made this covenant before you, before God, before our family and friends, with God at the center, and we need your help. And they'll go to other humans, and then they'll end up getting a divorce. You might say, well, what if I'm struggling? What am I supposed to do if I'm struggling? You know that there was a study done a few years ago. It was one of the most extensive, numerically extensive, and long-ranging studies. They did a study among a lot of people, and over a long period of time, they did this study, and it showed that not only are married people consistently more satisfied with their life than those who are living together or divorced, but it showed this, that those who said that they were dissatisfied or very dissatisfied in their marriage, that within the next 5 years, over 2/3 of those people described their marriage, if they stayed married to that same person that they were dissatisfied with or very dissatisfied with, over 2/3 of them within 5 years said that they were satisfied or very satisfied in their marriage. That it comes in waves. Linda Waite, who's a sociologist from the University of Chicago, she did a part of this study, the co-author of The Case for Marriage. She concluded, based on that information, she says the benefits of divorce have been oversold. The benefits of divorce have been oversold. Lewis Smedes, a Christian ethicist, said, when I married my wife, I had hardly a smidgen of sense for what I was getting into with her. How could I know how much she would change over 25 years? How could I know how much I would change? He said, my wife has lived with at least 5 different men since we were wed, and each one of the 5 has been me. The connecting link with my old self has always been the memory of the name that I took on back there. I am he who will always be there with you. He said, through all the change of her and of me, the one common thread was that I took on a name that I will be the one who will be there with you. When I talk to couples, a lot of times I tell them that a wedding is so important that we understand covenant wedding, but it's really not just about the love you have for each other. It's about the love that you're committing to have for the rest of your lives. Because this love is going to look different. It might look a little different. And here's the reality. When I look at my marriage, biblical covenant marriage, I start thinking about the vows that I made to my wife and how one-sided they are. Because biblical covenant marriage is a 3-part union, but it's really a one-sided covenant. Because when I stood up there with my wife on our wedding day, I said, I promise to be true to you. I promise to love you in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, till death do us part, right? All these things I said. And I didn't say, I promise to be true to you as long as I promise to love you in sickness and health as long as for better or for worse. Well, really just for better. We didn't do any of that stuff. She didn't say those things to me. We made a commitment that actually didn't have conditions. I made a promise to my wife that didn't have any of those conditions. It was a one-sided covenant. Now, I believed when I stood up there that she was going to return those to me, which is a beautiful thing in marriage when that happens. But when I married my wife 18 years ago, I was in love with my wife. Absolutely in love with my wife. Still am today, but here's the deal. I love her more now than I did then. We've grown in our love together. And this might sound harsh. It's not because she's necessarily, changed a whole lot. And I'm like, oh man, she's just such a better person than what she was. She's an amazing person, always has been. She's grown in a lot of ways. It's not because she's necessarily more lovable and now I love her more because she's more lovable. She's always been lovable. It's not because we never fight, because we do fight. And even after what I just said, I might get in a fight later, right? But all of these things, the reality is the reason I love her more is because we've made a commitment to each other and I've pressed on with that commitment and we've taken on these challenges side by side, going through life. Our struggles, we've had plenty of struggles. We've had plenty of fights. But everything we come across, we've promised that we're going to do it side by side. We don't talk about divorce in our house. I made a promise that would never come out of our mouths. It never will come out of our mouths. If one of our kids said, are you guys ever going to get divorced? I would say, no, absolutely not. That will never happen. And you might say, well, if that was asked to me, I'd probably be like, well, a lot of people get divorced. We're going to try not to. No. That's not a conversation we have. I made a promise to her, and guess what? I'm going to make the same promise to my kids. I made a promise to your mom, and I'm going to make a promise to you. We're going to stay together. No matter what comes, we're going to do it side by side because we entered into a covenant before God that God joined us together. And so we're going to live true to that covenant. In October of 2011, Gordon and Norma Yeager, Gordon was 94 years old, and Norma was 90 years old. They had been married for 72 years, and they died on the same day, an hour apart. They lived in a small town in Iowa. They went out to run some errands and got in a car accident and never made it back. And in a small town, as you can imagine, a couple that's been married for 72 years, that a lot of people knew them in the town. And so when they came in, everybody kind of knew who they were, and they quickly found out that the couple was not going to make it, just all the damage and internal bleeding and stuff like that. And their son, Dennis, kept saying that they kept asking about each other. They said, my back hurts or my head hurts or things like that, but how's that person doing? And when they found out that they weren't going to make it, they put them side by side. They brought them into the same room, put them side by side. The family gathered around. And here's what Dennis said. Gordon died at 3:38, holding hands with his wife, with the family around him, and he said this. He said, it was strange. They were holding hands, and Dad stopped breathing, but I couldn't figure out what was going on because the heart monitor was still going. But we were like, he isn't breathing. How does he still have a heartbeat? The nurse checked and said that's because they were holding hands. Her heart was beating through him and picking it up. At 4:38, exactly 1 hour after he died, Norma passed away too. And Dennis Yeager in this interview said they just loved being together. They were old-fashioned. They believed in marriage till death do you part. Sometimes one or the other would get mad, but they worked everything out. In the end, they chose each other, and that was it. They were committed. Now, he calls it old-fashioned, but I call that biblical covenant marriage. God designed, God directed, God honoring, God blessed, biblical covenant marriage.